Hello, everyone. My name is Jen DiMartino, and I'm the Executive Director of ALS One. Welcome to the inaugural installment of the ALS Publication Review Series. Really excited to delve into this new initiative. Before we do, I would like to give you a short background on ALS One. We were formed just over 8 years ago by a very dear friend of mine, Kevin Gosnell, who, after his diagnosis in 2015 at the age of 46, sought to make the world a better place by uniting researchers, clinicians, and care providers to work together to not only advance research more effectively and efficiently by collaboration and open lines of communication, but also ensure that patients received the resources and essential equipment needed to live their best life by uniting care providers with clinicians and opening those lines of communication as well. Kevin very sadly passed away just 7 months after our launch in 2016. But he guides us daily, and I can safely say that he would be very pleased with this new initiative, the collaboration that we have formed with NEALS to do so, and we're really excited about it, and so welcome. And to give you a little bit on the background on the actual initiative itself, it started a few months ago at a conversation at NEALS when their NICE committee, which, by the way, they're all extremely nice people, but the acronym actually stands for NEALS Information and Communication Education. They were discussing resources and initiatives for the ALS community and gaps that lay therein and ways that we could help. And they started talking about publications. And, there are so many incredible publications that are out there that just need to be amplified, that people need to see and know that they're there. And for the ones that are out there, how can we learn better from them? How can we help the ALS community really understand the contents? A lot of them are not, a lot of them are extremely scientific, but a lot of them are not overly scientific, but they just need to be explained a little bit more. And so we thought, let's try to bridge that gap. NEALS came to us and we thought, gosh, this would be a tremendous opportunity to help the ALS community. We were all in. We're really excited to spearhead this with NEALS. And the way it's going to work is it's going to be a three-pronged approach. So we'll be holding 2 webinars under the same overarching topic, 1 month apart. And then on the 3rd month, NEALS, so ALS One will take the first 2, and then NEALS for the 3rd will kind of take the first 2 topics and bring them all together under one umbrella and do a live session. So stay tuned for more to come on the next topic, the next research publication, and the date for the NEALS publication as well. Which brings me to our first publication, which we are really excited about, our very first one. The publication that we'll be reviewing today is entitled Incorporating Genetic Testing into the Care of Patients with Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis / Frontotemporal Degeneration Spectrum Disorders. You probably well know that as ALS / FTD. It was a publication, it is a publication that I believe was launched in the fall of last year. It was written by Chelsea Chambers, Ashley Crook, Lauren Lichten, Laynie Dratch, and Wendy Ullman. And we are honored today to be here with two of the authors, Lauren Lichten and Laynie Dratch. And they're going to help us, along with our panelists, take a deep dive into the contents and help to answer some of the pressing questions. But first, would love to get to know you two a little bit better. So welcome. Thank you both so much for being here. We're really honored to have you. Maybe we can start by giving a little bit of your background, what got you into ALS, and what drove you to get into genetic counseling and to write this article. That would be great. So either one of you can start.
Sure, I can start. So I've been a genetic counselor for just about 19 years, which was really flown by. What drew me into the field was my interest and love for science, and I particularly was excited about a field where we'd be working with cutting edge scientific technologies. But the most important draw for me to the field that continues to be one of the most meaningful is the opportunity to work with families. And I think working as a genetic counselor is a unique role in the healthcare system, and that we often are involved in seeing generations of a single family, and can serve a meaningful role in helping families navigate what to do with newfound genetic information.
Amazing. That's great. Thank you, Lauren. Laynie?
Hi, my name is Laynie, and I have been a genetic counselor for less years than Lauren, but have really loved being in the profession and have, for my entire career, been involved with the ALS and FTD communities, which has been really special. My reasons to joining the field are quite similar to Lauren's. I was drawn to the medical community, but wasn't really interested in being an MD. And I really loved the idea of being able to work with families, and had the benefit of actually attending a conference that is hosted by the University of Pennsylvania's FTD Center every year, where they are putting out what resources exist for care persons of people with FTD spectrum disorders, which have overlap with ALS, as we'll get into, and heard a genetic counselor speak about the type of impact that their work can have on families, and immediately knew that it was something I wanted to do, to be able to be a resource for families where often people don't understand what they're going through or what it's like to be facing a genetic form of this condition, and really feeling like I can make a difference for individual families and also for the community, because resources are absolutely needed in this space.
Incredible. And it must be such an exciting time with, you know, all the advancements that are coming through with genetics and what we know now. So it's amazing. So I'd now like to introduce our panelists. We have three pretty incredible people here with us today. I'm excited to introduce Mandi Bailey, Dr. Justin Kwan, and Dave Shulman. I'm grateful to have you each with us as well, and hoping you can also share your personal stories and relationships to ALS. So maybe Mandi?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Mandi Bailey. I'm from Gulf Breeze, Florida. I lost my stepdad to ALS in 2018. And ever since then, I've tried to get involved with advocacy in any way I can. And I've really gotten interested in the research side of it because there's so much going on right now. And I'm really looking forward to this series and being able to help make that research more accessible to the public. So thank you for having me. I'm excited.
We're excited to have you here too. Dr. Kwan.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this fantastic event. My name is Justin Kwan. I'm a neurologist and neuromuscular specialist. I started my career in Houston almost 20 years ago. And what drew me to ALS as a field is that when I first cared for people living with ALS, I thought they were just the most incredible people. And their caregivers are some of the most giving and selfless people that I've ever met. So that was what drew me into the community. And of course, the ALS biology and how much we have learned about this disease in the past 15 to 20 years just has been tremendous. And I'm looking forward to understanding this disease in more detail so that we can finally get to a point where people can live with ALS indefinitely, and that we can come up with great treatments, and that we can really push this, move the needle in this field.
Very amazing. Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Dave Shulman?
Absolutely. So my name is Dave Shulman from Summit, New Jersey. I am a patient living with ALS. I was diagnosed last year at the age of 44. I've been pouring myself into the ALS landscape in terms of research. I've joined a number of patient advisory councils. I've attended some of the conferences, and in my case in particular, I do have a genetic form of ALS. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's challenging to think of the fact that it could extend, into subsequent generations. On the other hand, there's an identifiable target that we can address as medicine progresses. So I'm super excited about this topic and look forward to contributing to this important dialogue.
Thank you so much, Dave. I've had the opportunity to meet with you and in Switzerland, I believe, and yeah, you've there's collective strength here in this panel, that's for sure, and a lot of inspiration. Dave, you're definitely one of them, and Mandi, all of you. Really tremendous. It's it's incredible, the journeys that take people to the pathways of ALS, and it can be a pretty lonely path. So to have people come together to work towards making it basically a much shorter path is really what makes the biggest impact. So again, thank you all so much for being here today. Lauren and Laynie, it would be, I think, really great to have a brief synopsis of the publication. I know that we have all some questions. We've all read the publication, which is really tremendous, and we have some questions from us and some other members of the ALS community. But if you could give a brief synopsis, it would be fantastic.
Sure. So I can give a little summary, and Lauren can fill in anything I can miss. Just some context for why we thought it was important to write about this topic is that there has been a lot of talk in the field, both in the literature and among groups of genetic counselors. Like, for example, Lauren and I are part of an ALS FTD working group that I established with some colleagues back in 2021 that now has over 70 genetic counselors with interest in ALS and FTD. We've been talking about, the direction the field's going, and what the resources we need, and what is sort of the pulse and what's happening in clinical care. And so discussions among groups like that in the literature and at different conferences and networking events, we really felt like there's been this push towards understanding that genetic counseling and testing are important to offer to all people with ALS, FTD spectrum disorders, but not really any guidance for how we get there, and an understanding from our group that even though ideally we would love everyone to be able to see a genetic counselor before they proceed with genetic testing, knowing that genetic counselors are a limited resource, and that's just not going to be a feasible expectation for the field. And so what we really wanted to do was empower neurologists and other care team members to start at least integrating the discussion of genetic testing into their care for people with ALS and FTD. And so we wanted to give them a little bit of sense of, what are the key points to convey, what are some of the logistical considerations, and when should you really be thinking about referring to a genetic counselor? Like, when is it best to tag us in? So Lauren, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
Yeah, I think that certainly covers our main goal, and just to highlight how fast the area of genetics and ALS and FTD spectrum conditions is evolving. When I did my training, we knew of one gene, SOD1. And then since 2013, really, there's been an explosion of the number of genes that have been associated with the two conditions, information out there, and then, of course, the first FDA-approved treatment, along with a multitude of clinical trials and research opportunities. And so it's hard even in the field of genetic counseling to keep people up to date on all these advancements. And so given that many neurologists have done their training long before many of these advancements occurred, we thought it was important for there to be a short piece that puts together some of the key points to begin to get families access to genetic testing that can be instrumental in changing the course of their individual and family members' experiences.
Well, it was a really great article, and we thank you for writing about it so in depth. It's a tough topic, obviously you guys know that, you all know that more than anyone. Very tough topic, and we hear about it so often. I know we all have questions, and maybe I'll start with one that I have often heard people talk about in families who are impacted. One is there an obligation for, say, you have a known gene in your family, a gene mutation, and you get tested? Is there, or that you find out rather that there is a known mutation in your family? Are there any legal parameters that you need to let your family know? I often hear that question. Or is it just kind of however your family dynamic is? Is there anything that is from a legal standpoint that if you know about in your family, you have to tell people, you have to tell others I'm talking about in your family, not the general public?
Not at this time. So you're right that this is a complex issue, and it's important for people to think about before they have the test. And so what will this mean for me, and would it impact other people in my family, and how do I plan on telling them about this? And that's one key place genetic counselor can be really helpful, as well as a place that the neurologist and ordering provider can at least start those conversations, because family relationships can be complex. And so it's important for people to be considering that before they have the test, because the test can open up a lot of other information that can be hard to digest. So the provider is legally responsible for making sure that the person who had the positive genetic test knows that this is important information for family members. But there's not actually laws that would require that individual to share with their family. It can feel really scary and overwhelming. A lot of the vocabulary in genetics is complicated. People are dealing with so many emotions at the same point. And this is where genetic counselors can be really helpful. So oftentimes I'll meet with a family together. Zoom has made that quite easy. So that way all the family member needs to do is gather up people who want to hear the information, and I can explain the genetics. We often provide a written short letter that describes what the genetic test result was, how to find a genetic counselor or expert healthcare provider for at-risk family members. And so the healthcare team can really play an instrumental role in taking some of the burden of sharing the information off of the first individual who had testing.
And I'll add that sometimes even in a genetic counseling visit, like say, even if it wasn't a genetic counselor who ordered the test, if you refer to a genetic counselor because there was a positive finding and the person hasn't yet communicated that information to their family members, sometimes we can even practice with that person. What do they want to say? How do they want to say it? And make sure that they are getting across what the key information is. And then, as Lauren said, leaning on us to fill in the rest, right? Helping them to fill down what does the family need to know, and how do they get in touch with us for further information, whether that's through a family follow-up visit or individual counseling.
Thank you. Really tough questions. And I would think that sometimes there's a line where you are a genetic counselor and you become a family therapist. And so that's got to be a very tough dynamic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mandi, I think you had a couple or.
Yeah, I do. And I think one of my first questions plays right into what we were just discussing. In areas that may not have access to those genetic counselors, like my area, for example, we live in a desert of care. There's very few resources. Very few healthcare professionals are even very familiar with ALS, FTD, or any of that here. So what resources might be available for those professionals to help them have these conversations with the people that they need to?
So I sort of hear your question in two ways, like what resources might be available to the families and what resources might be available to the providers. And so I'll try my best to address a little bit of both, and Lauren can fill in as well. But so one of the things that I think is really important is that genetic counseling is now widely accessible through telehealth services. And so even if you don't live in a state or a country even where genetic counseling is available in person at a local clinic, you might be able to access those resources virtually by video visits. There are restrictions through licensure and other laws that make it not possible for you to see any particular genetic counselor necessarily, but there are some companies where genetic counselors are certified across states. And to your point, not everybody is going to have in-depth experience with ALS and FTD, but there are genetic counselors at some of these telehealth companies or counselors that work in clinics, but also have licensure in other states that do have expertise in ALS and FTD. And so that is one resource to make sure people are aware of. Another is that there are resources online, even if you can't meet with a genetic counselor, but there are resources that different advocacy organizations have collated in terms of just like education and support, sometimes just in terms of, text in websites, but also in terms of videos, as well as support groups that are run. And so even if you can't meet with a professional to discuss some of the issues that are coming up for you, it might be worthwhile connecting with others in the same situation and see what's worked well for them and what they've learned. So those are some resources that come to mind to me. Lauren, are there others you want to add?
Yeah, and just to emphasize, when we wrote this paper, one thing that our group thought about as we created some of the tables and figures was that we envisioned it to be used as a resource for providers who do not work with these issues as regularly, so they would have the key pieces of information. We have a growing group of genetic counselors who have expertise in this area. And one of the projects for this year is that we want to have a more complete database of who we are, where we are, and so that way we can serve as a source of information and education for providers as well. Oftentimes I find myself doing that if I'm working with a family member here in Georgia and they have someone that can't get to Georgia or less resources. One place that our team can be helpful is talking to that provider and coaching them through the testing or counseling considerations for the patient living further away.
And kind of a follow-up on that too. How receptive have the physicians been that maybe aren't genetic counselors or aren't as familiar with this stuff? How receptive are they to adding this in? Because we know, healthcare professionals are busy. They have a lot to do in a normal appointment. What has your experience with that been?
Yeah, so I can add just a quick tidbit that might not have come through if this is the first publication that anyone watching has really dove into in the genetic counseling and testing space for ALS and FTD, is that our colleague Jennifer Rogenbach, around the same time that we wrote this, was in the process of finalizing with other colleagues published guidelines for offering genetic counseling and testing to all persons with ALS. And so that's another resource that I just want to highlight there. And I think that has also given some weight to the the importance of really making the time and effort to integrate this into care. So I think that perhaps that has helped with receptivity a little bit, and that it's, we've got these evidence-based consensus guidelines that now also exist, and perhaps we can in the description include a link to that paper as well. But I think it varies based on the resources of the clinic and perhaps the comfort of the clinician. So it's hard for me to speak broadly to everyone. I can speak to my clinic's experience. Maybe Lauren, you can also add as well. But for our clinic, we actually already were offering genetic testing to all persons with ALS prior to Jen Rogenbach's guidelines coming out and our paper coming out, just because we saw the direction the advances were heading, and we saw how valuable it can be to at least just offer this to everybody. But our clinic is unique in that we have a genetic counselor embedded in it. And not all ALS clinics are going to have the benefit of that. In fact, most do not. And so for neurologists that don't have, and for ALS clinics, that don't have a genetic counselor embedded, it is, a big logistical consideration and a time consideration for these clinics. I know that there have been efforts to gather some data on this topic, but I think we have yet to really see how has the shift that we feel in the importance of this translated to the shift in genetic testing practices. Some of the more recent data we have in the literature is still from around 2017.
Yeah, to echo Laynie's experience, I'm grateful that I work with a team of healthcare providers led by neurologists who saw the value in genetic testing and genetic counseling early. So I think there's probably more of a need than we're able to account for currently. And the last publication I'm familiar with that tried to assess how often people were getting genetic testing was before some of the biggest developments happened. So I think it's important to regularly collect data about who's getting genetic testing. One important thing to also consider is that in some families, not everyone can even get a diagnosis of ALS or FTD. And so in the past, people had the opinion that genetic testing should be reserved for people at a very strong family history with multiple people impacted, but not everyone has a complete family history, the ability to get clear diagnoses. And so really we're shifting more towards genetic testing being offered to everyone who has a diagnosis regardless of family history, which is a little bit different than the older ways of thinking about this.
Sounds like you kind of already answered my next question, which was, I was just curious on how often genetic testing is being done. But it kind of sounds like that's a hard number to kind of put a finger on.
Yeah, I think we need an updated survey of current practice in the era of, published guidelines and an approved therapy. Because I do really think, even though there's a bunch of other, benefits of offering genetic testing and benefits of a genetic diagnosis, I feel like, and Lauren, correct me if you feel differently, but I feel like the approval of an FDA approved therapy coming to light has really been a catalyst for pushing this on the radar of clinics who might have otherwise been resistant, and really just bringing everyone into a more similar mindset of, hey, there are real potential clinical management implications of a genetic diagnosis, and therefore this is not something that we can delay and put in the back seat anymore.
100% agree. I think in the past, genetic testing, the prime purpose was to provide an explanation and the opportunity for other at-risk family members to get information to help in aspects of planning their life, but with no opportunity for intervention. And so now things are shifting towards it's potentially important for people to consider testing because there might be something we could do about it. We're not quite there yet, but it's really hopeful. I hope we get to see that time where we are able to get there. There are clinical trials going on where people who have tested and found that they have a genetic mutation, but they don't yet have symptoms yet. Those individuals, some of them are being followed in clinical trials, with the opportunity to give them an intervention earlier. And so why wait for someone to have symptoms of the disease? Is there an earlier point that we could either slow symptoms or stop them from happening? And so in order to even do those type of trials, we need to identify who those people are and make sure that they know about those research opportunities.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed reading the paper and getting a chance to pick your mind, so I appreciate your time.
Dr. Kwan, I know you had a couple of questions. Would you like to go next?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say how valuable genetics counselors are. I think I have leaned heavily, and I've been very fortunate have been in institutions where genetics counseling was available. And I just want to just congratulate the two of you on this great publication, just all the work that that you do for the ALS community. So that's really fantastic. But I did want to piggyback on this concept of people, individuals living with ALS and having a family history. This comes up not infrequently that we have individuals who may have symptoms of ALS, and then when we take a careful family history, it turns out that they may be extended family who have been diagnosed with either ALS or FTD, because we are asking those questions now. And we send out the genetic panel to one of the companies, the CLIA certified companies, 31 genes, including C9, and the testing's negative. And many of our patients find this really challenging. What does this mean? How should I discuss with my family who are, on the edge of their seats, waiting for the results to come back? So if you can weigh in on that question, that would be great.
I'll let you start, Laynie, and I can fill in if you'd like.
Sure. So I think just for some context, it's helpful to share for those listening. And first of all, thank you for all the kind words about genetic counseling. We need our champions, and I'm glad that you found that genetic counseling has been a valuable resource. And so I will say, for some context for those listening who might be less familiar with, what's the likelihood we actually can find a genetic cause if someone has ALS with or without a family history, for example. Let me just start by saying that if somebody with ALS has a family history of other people with clearly defined ALS or FTD, there's actually a pretty high chance that we can find something on testing with today's current, technology and genetics understanding. So about 70% of the time, depending on which publication you pull, we can find a genetic answer when someone's got ALS with a clear family history. But to Lauren's point earlier, family history is not always so easy to define because it can be hard to get an accurate diagnosis. And especially the further back you go in generations, the harder it can be to get, for those people to have gotten an accurate diagnosis and to have shared it, which relates back to part of our conversation earlier about sharing information in the family. And so there are still, though, a subset of people who have ALS and have a clear family history of ALS or FTD, and on testing, based on our current, knowledge, we can't find something. So this is to Dr. Kwan's point. It is a smaller subset of people that fall into that scenario, but it does sometimes happen. And so the counseling that family would receive would be tailored to their unique situation. Like what does the family history actually look like? What testing was performed? Those sorts of things. But what the general implication for the family would be is that the family members are still considered at an increased risk based on their family history. And they would be encouraged to stay in touch with the genetic counselor and care team over time for updates, because new genes are discovered over time as being linked to these conditions, and technology advances, and we can get better at, detecting different variants. For example, the most common genetic cause of ALS and FTD wasn't even identified until 2011. And so it's really important for these families to stay in touch with us over time, especially if it's been a long time since the testing occurred. But in that scenario, it's a little harder for family members because we don't have an answer in the diagnosed person to then test at-risk family members for if they wanted to further refine their risk. And so there's more uncertainty that they're living with. And that in itself can be a reason for them to consider genetic counseling or even mental health therapy, just to cope with living with that uncertainty that arises from those situations. So those are my gut reactions to the situation. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to add anything to that.
It can be a really hard situation, and I think that's one of the points to make sure people having testing understand before they have the test, that there's a variety of possible results, and all results come with their own emotions that can go along with it. So sometimes patients can feel surprised. Well, why am I feeling unsettled or having some difficult emotions surrounding a test coming back not finding a genetic cause? Shouldn't I feel good about that? But for some families, they really want to find an explanation. They want those opportunities to participate in research. And so it's important for the clinician who's ordering the test and going over the results to make sure that they leave space in the consultation to address these emotions that come along with having the test. Oftentimes people aren't only thinking about themselves, and those results can have broad implications, and it's not so simple to categorize the emotions that people might be feeling. So, to call it someone and say, good news, we didn't find a genetic cause. Well, it might not be, initially something people feel happy about having a genetic cause, but for some people, they feel like that information is empowering. Maybe they were worried that there was something else that contributed to their symptoms, even if their providers have told them, no, we don't think that's related. Having that genetic answer can be really important. But then after you get it, thinking about, well, what does this mean for my siblings, for my kids? That can be really heavy to think about. And so the genetics itself is complicated, but the emotions can be just as big to go along with it. So I encourage people to kind of pause and leave space for that with the families they're interacting with, because that could be as big to deal with as understanding the genetic information.
Well, great, thank you for that. I think that, Lauren, I absolutely agree with you. Having a positive result or a negative result can be, it can be emotionally difficult to process. So I absolutely agree. Now, to dovetail on my previous question, so when sometimes the testing for a panel comes back negative, and we do offer patients whole exome and whole genome sequencing. Would the two of you be able to speak a little bit more towards that? What is whole genome sequencing versus whole exome sequencing, and how is it different from panel testing versus single gene testing? Because technology has really changed so much in terms of our approach. And yeah, so if you could speak on that, that would be great.
Yeah, so this kind of gets us into a biology 101 lesson. So if we think about how our body works, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of genes, and those genes encode for RNA, which is directions to make a protein, which is important in our body. It gets more complicated than that, and because within our genetic material, there's information that is important to make up those genes. And so the coding parts of genes are called exons. And so we think of whole exome sequencing, we're looking at all those coding regions all together. Where if we look at the whole genome, there's pieces of DNA that we don't really have a good sense as a scientific community what they're important for. They might be important for regulating other genes or how the DNA folds in the cell. It's, ongoing research going on. And so when we do a testing panel, we generally have a list of genes that we know are related to the reason we're doing testing. So there are often genes that have been known to be related to ALS or FTD or groups of conditions in that family. And so with the size of the panel, the bigger you get, the more broad the lab might be in including genes on there. So sometimes we can find ourselves in a position where a gene has been added on that there's really not a lot of evidence for what to say about it. And so it's important to know people's level of uncertainty that they're comfortable with before you pick which test is going to be right. And then you can get broader. So an exome is just looking at those coding pieces of everything. And so that can tell us about ALS and FTD genes, but then also about genes related to conditions like cancer or other conditions completely unrelated to the cause of testing, whereas genome is even broader. And so the bigger you get, the more likely it is that you're going to find something. It may or may not have anything to do with the reason for testing. And oftentimes when we're doing testing after a new diagnosis of ALS or FTD, there's a lot going on. And so knowing what people can tolerate is important. The more that you test, the more likely it is that we can find results that are unclear, so variants of uncertain significance. And the challenge with adult onset diseases is oftentimes to clarify what a variant of uncertain significance means. It's helpful to have information from the generation above, that individual's parents. And with adult onset conditions, we may or may not have those individuals' parents available for testing. And even if we do, a lot of the genes that go along with ALS and FTD, we're still trying to figure out the penetrance. And so if you have a mutation, how likely it is for you to show symptoms. And so it's somewhat unclear. So the easiest situation would be that you know that someone with this change should have symptoms by a certain age, and testing other family members is helpful. But with adult onset diseases, we're really not there yet in terms of very clearly being able to categorize those inconclusive results. And so the key things to discuss when deciding on a test is how much information is going to be helpful for the family, what would be available to you. Are there any other family members available for testing if you had an uncertain result? And is receiving information unrelated to the cause for testing something the individual and family is ready to receive?
Mhm. And I'll just add a couple of other things that are, as you're speaking, are jogging ideas for me, which is that another area to think about with exome and genome, those broader tests, is that sometimes a family is like really motivated to get as much information as they can. And one of the cool things about exome and genome is that even if that first test is not diagnostic, we don't find something, those are types of tests that we can do what's called reanalysis over time. And so once the lab spells out that person's DNA code, the lab has that DNA sequence spelled out. And so even without having to submit a new sample over time, the laboratory can go back and look at the data and say, okay, with all the new publications that have come out, with the new people who have been tested, is there anything new that we see when we look at your DNA sequence that could explain, why you've developed your symptoms? So that's another thing that sometimes families will consider. And from a clinician's perspective, when thinking about choosing the right test, sometimes, as Lauren was saying, there can be genes related to ALS, FTD, and other conditions in the family or other overlapping things. And so sometimes going broader, like an exome or a genome, might make sense based on how a person's symptoms are presenting or what else is popping up in their family that might be more complicated. So for example, if a person is still being evaluated for possible ALS, but we haven't quite confirmed the diagnosis yet, and other conditions are still on the differential, like hereditary spastic paraplegia or other conditions, like hereditary motor neuropathy that can look similar to ALS, but it's hard to sometimes clinically distinguish right away. Sometimes sending that broader testing will give the referring clinician more information to help them sort out what the diagnosis even is. So it depends where you meet someone in the diagnostic process as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. And Lauren, thank you for weighing into the whole issue of variant uncertain clinical significance. I know that comes up quite a bit. So yeah, thank you for just that explanation. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, and the other thing, as Laynie was talking, that came to mind that is relevant in a field where we really quite recently have identified a lot of the genes related to ALS is the concept of a gene of uncertain significance. So sometimes on those broader tests, exome and genome, we might find something that hasn't been reported in the literature, but when you go in and do more research about the function of that particular gene, you realize it's connected to motor neurons in some way. And so that finding can be tagged as both a gene and a variant of uncertain significance. And so we're in a new age of genetics where some of the genes are discovered as part of the clinical testing, as opposed to all of those findings happening in a research setting before getting into the clinical environment.
Great. Thank you.
Dave.
Excellent. And by the way, we've covered a lot of really great
Amazing,
ground.
right?
So
Yeah, really
I
incredible.
really want to kind of build on some of that, if that's okay. So,
Mhm.
one of the interesting things I took away in Basel late last year was a study showing that there are genes in sporadic ALS that were identified that were showing up as they analyzed the genomes of patients that don't have a genetic mutation. And I wonder, how do you think as that research kind of comes to fruition more and more, do you think that this whole genome or whole exome sequencing will become more of the norm? And we're just curious for your take on some of the latest research.
I think there's just so much we don't know right now. And right now, as we talked about earlier in the session, it's hard to get everyone who has ALS genetic testing to start with. And so at this point in time, we don't necessarily have good information about of everyone walking around on Earth who has these mutations and doesn't have symptoms. We don't necessarily have good strategies of identifying who those people are. Oftentimes we come across them incidentally because someone with a new diagnosis, oftentimes it comes up if we test their parents and we learn that somehow their parent has the same exact genetic finding and they're well in their 80s. I think that can be hard to incorporate to how your family's thinking about things, especially for people who don't have symptoms and are deciding to have testing. But it gives a lot of hope that not everyone who has a genetic mutation is necessarily going to get the disease. And also from a scientific perspective, it gives the scientists something to look for. Well, what are those other factors that are helping people who have the mutation but don't have the disease? There must be something that maybe they can target with therapies. And so finding out more about the people who aren't getting testing because they're coming to the clinic, their genetic status will be helpful. It does complicate the job of genetic counselors and healthcare professionals because that is really hard to get information that's very uncertain that says, well, this could mean that you'll develop ALS or FTD, or it might not mean nothing at all. So knowing how people should incorporate that into their lives is challenging. A lot of genetic information comes with positive aspects of it, but it can come with a lot of uncertainty. So I think it's exciting to see the field evolving, but it becomes hard on an individual level because there's just not answers to a lot of the questions that patients and families have about the information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great question about like where the research is heading. I think to Lauren's point, the evolving penetrance data is something that we're all grappling with, both from a provider perspective and from a patient perspective of what do these results actually mean for me as an individual? Because to Lauren's point, a lot of the data is when you look across people overall, we can say not everybody gets symptoms, but what we want to be able to tell the person in front of us is, well, what does this mean for you individually? So there's a lot of research left to be done. And to your question about should everyone be getting exome and genome? I can tell you that insurance sometimes poses a barrier to that being a possibility. And so often in the United States, at least, so often, we start with the more focused testing of the 30 or so genes that we know can cause ALS and FTD. And then in our practice at University of Pennsylvania, we do offer exome or genome to people who have had negative testing and want to consider more information, but how often they're actually able to complete that depends on things like insurance coverage and whether they even feel up to doing another test and those sorts of things. So I would love if I could wave my magic wand and fix a problem and the healthcare system. One of many things I'd love to fix is that I would love to be able to offer genome sequencing to any person who has a diagnosis and wants to understand why. But at this point, there's just a lot of barriers to being able to do that. But I do think that eventually that is a direction the field could be heading.
Well, I'd vote for you, Laynie, if there is a role to go fix the U.S. healthcare system. So, I mean, building on that, so ultimately what that points to is everyone who has ALS or FTD should be offered to have the opportunity to get genetic testing or counseling, right? What about, right now there's no gene therapy available yet for C9 ALS and FTD, and that's the largest genetic cause of both of those diseases. and, you know, pretty massive in the field of, right? What would you say to a patient or family who are reluctant to accept the offer of testing or counseling? Is there, you know, considerations that you would share?
I think first maybe some context here for me that feels important is that I think it's really important before the test is even offered. If someone is really motivated for clinical trials or approved therapies, and that's the main reason they're thinking about testing, I think first and foremost, it's important for the person to have a conversation, whether it's with a genetic counselor or neurologist, about the possibilities of the outcomes of the test, right? Because one of the things that's possible from genetic testing is that we could do a genetic test and find a difference in a gene like C9orf72, for example, where we've now answered why you've developed the condition, but there's not an ongoing trial, or there's not an approved therapy. Or there's even the possibility we could find a difference in a gene and there is an ongoing trial or, approved therapy, but your specific variant might not help you qualify, or the trial might be still in their enrollment, or you might not qualify for some other reason that you don't fit their inclusion/exclusion criteria. So I think it's really important that we set expectations from the get-go about what does it mean to do the genetic testing in relation to the hopes of accessing trials and treatments. And so if someone is reluctant to consider genetic testing, I think that's when it's really important to have a conversation about, okay, well, what are your goals? Why were you considering this in the first place? What are you hoping to get out of it? And if someone is saying this isn't for me, then it's our job to absolutely respect that. The genetic counselor's role and the other members on the care team talking about genetic testing, our role is not to say everybody with ALS should have genetic testing, but rather that they get the opportunity to have it if they want. And when someone decides after having all the appropriate information that this is not for them, then I feel fantastic that they have made the decision that's best for them. So what we care most about is that they have the information and the opportunities to ask the questions and have the conversation and then make the decision that's best for them and their family.
And I think I'll add that it can be an ongoing conversation. A mentee of mine did a research project a couple of years ago that we need to get out and publish, but an idea that came out of that research was the idea of the option of genetic testing that's brought up more than once, not necessarily more than once in the same appointment, but a lot of times that the option of genetic testing might be brought up at one of those initial visits where someone's just learning about the diagnosis and has a long list of different things to adjust to in many aspects of their lives, and adding genetic testing onto that list oftentimes might not be the best set of circumstances for anyone involved. And so everyone's born with their DNA being what it's going to be. A more appropriate time to have the discussion might be when things kind of settle down a little bit more, and so maybe introduce the idea that genetic testing is out there and it's something that the team is happy to discuss at a later time. And so sometimes people may initially say there's just too many things to think about, I'm overwhelmed figuring out how to incorporate this new diagnosis into my life, I don't want to deal with one more thing. But if it was brought up again maybe a month or 2 months later, people might be approaching the conversation differently. And so that was one of the suggestions that came out of this research project was the idea of revisiting the idea of genetic testing over time, because people's initial response to it may not be how they feel about it later on. It could not change, but I think it often needs to be an ongoing discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Makes perfect sense. So, I mean, if everyone buys in, or if the general, landscape or key opinion leaders buy into the fact that this needs to be the new standard, it's a pretty fragmented global, even in the country, landscape. How do you roll out and drive adoption of this new standard of care practice?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll make a selfish plug that currently our genetic counseling national organizations are trying to push forward a bill called the Access to Genetic Counselors Act. And basically, the profession of genetic counseling is fairly new profession. And so when the guidelines for Medicare were written up, genetic counselors were not listed as healthcare providers who can order and provide genetic counseling, order genetic testing, despite genetic counselors being quite equipped to do so. And so the lack of federal recognition often is a rate limiting step to have departments who need genetic counselors to have the funding to get genetic counselors on their team. And so anyone can talk to their legislatures to encourage them to sign on in support of this change to the law, because hopefully that change would allow there to be an increased number of genetics professionals embedded in neurology clinics. But we're not going to be able to train genetic counselors fast enough to get them everywhere that's needed in the healthcare system. And so other creative ideas are going to be needed.
Yeah, and just to add, building on that from the U.S. perspective, since we know access varies even within the U.S., but to the global point, I know that there's really great work being done by the International Alliance of ALS MND Associations, led by Kathy Cummings, who has collected some recent data that I don't think I'm at liberty to discuss, but I had the pleasure of getting a sneak preview recently. We're talking like a week ago. And so there is at least efforts being enacted to understand what is the global landscape of who has access to counseling, who has access to testing, what's being offered. And then I think the next phase is what you raised, Dave, which is now how do we address these gaps? And so there are a lot of organizations working to try to at least bridge that gap from like an education perspective. But I think we're going to need to do more work similar to what Lauren was describing in the US, but throughout the world to work on the issue of access to the actual counseling and testing itself. So I hope that if you were to ask us the same question a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, we would have answers as to what actions have been taken. But I think we're right now at the cusp of where, okay, we have now acknowledged that this is an issue in the field. We have gotten consensus guidelines out there on the ILS side. I know there's people that I collaborate with in the FTD community where we're trying to push the similar paths forward on the FTD side, because even though there's overlap in these conditions and that we would love to see concerted efforts, oftentimes the efforts are a bit siloed. So we've acknowledged the problem. It's out there. I feel like we're getting the buy-in from people who need to acknowledge this issue, and now we need to really work on implementing this into clinical care practice across the world.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Really amazing information. I know that we are approaching end time. I don't know if you folks have a couple of minutes there. You know, we talked about penetrance. That has come up a few times that we've sort of touched on, but I know that there are obviously different penetrance levels based on the gene mutation. I didn't know if quickly this is, you know, something that comes up. A lot of people, you know, is their fear, you know, if I get if I go through the testing and I test positive for C9 or SOD1, you know, what is the likelihood that if I live a good long life, I'm going to get it? Is there a big discrepancy in the rate that is caused?
Yeah, that raises an important point of just the emotional aspect of this process and fear that can go along with having genetic testing. I think a common misconception that people have about even seeing a genetic counselor is that seeing the genetic counselor means you have to have genetic testing. And as Laynie said earlier, our role as a genetic counselor is to make sure people have the information they need and the support they need in order to make the decision that's best for them. And so I think recognizing that meeting with a genetic counselor does not mean that you have to move forward with any specific path. It's really an information gathering expedition. And sometimes there can be misconceptions in families, whether it's about penetrance? Can, this is what I saw in my grandmother. Would that mean the same for me? And so a genetic counselor can be really helpful there. The bottom line is that there's a lot of information that genetic testing can give you. So do you have the genetic mutation in the family or not? But it can't necessarily tell us what age someone will get symptoms, what those symptoms will be, the rate of progression, whether they'll have symptoms at all. Some genes and mutations, we're starting to get a little bit better information about to provide that information to families. But we want to make sure, as Laynie said earlier, that expectations before someone has a test are aligned with what the test can actually tell us, because that can be really upsetting to go through and have a genetic test thinking, well, it's going to tell me if I get symptoms, what they'll be and what age I get them. And then all of a sudden you get this information and that's not at all what it's able to tell you. So I think, having those things lined up beforehand can be really helpful in helping people incorporate the information into their lives.
Yeah, I think too, there's, like you said, there's misnomers. And I think just meeting with a genetic counselor in general, if someone knowingly has a mutation in their family and they know that because their grandmother or grandfather passed away at age 72, does that make it more likely that if someone in my family also inherits this gene, that would be the age that they would then too, or does that have nothing to do with it?
Right. So I think that's why it's really important for people to have these conversations, because you can get the tailored information of everything we know about the specific variant. Because as Lauren said, for some variants within genes, we can say, yes, typically the age of onset tends to be similar, or the speed of progression tends to be, rapid or slower. And for some variants, we can say it's all over the map. We don't know, anything more than you have this risk. And so I think it's really important to gather that information specific to your family, to whatever extent is possible based on what we know about that variant. I also think, to your comment about penetrance, it's evolving, right? Like we are learning more over time as more people are tested, as more people who are family members of people diagnosed are tested. It's an evolving target. But I just want to clarify for people who might be listening, if they've read the article, this is a little different from what we were talking about in the paper, right? The paper was focused on diagnostic testing, which is genetic testing for a person who's already got ALS or FTD or symptoms highly suspicious for those. Whereas what we've sort of shifted to talking about now is predictive testing, where a person who doesn't have any symptoms is looking to see if they inherited risk for it. So those are two very different things. And we did not address many of the ethical, like logistical, emotional considerations that go into predictive counseling and testing. And that's when it's absolutely imperative that somebody meets with a genetic counselor before considering testing. Whereas when a person already has a diagnosis of ALS or FTD and they're looking to understand why, it's still obviously a very personal decision what they want to do with that. But that's something where a neurologist or another team member may feel equipped to start that process for you. But if you're considering predictive testing for someone not symptomatic, considering learning more about their risk, that's when a genetic counselor comes into play for all these things that you're raising, because there's so many questions, there's so many emotions, there's legal considerations, emotional considerations, and that's when we can really make a difference.
And the other thing, thank you for making that important clarifying point, Laynie. The other thing to make sure clinicians leave space for in the appointment is to hear the patient and family story about what was your family told. If there is a known mutation in the family, what was your family told about it? Because this information is moving so fast. It could be that the information available at the time does not include some of the more recent information. There could be, families out there that don't even realize that there's an FDA approved treatment for one gene out there now. And so making sure that we start from a standpoint of like the last time the family talked about this, if it's a no mutation in the family, things might have been much different scientifically. And so it's important to spend time leaving room for families to get updates from the clinical care team, but also bringing people up to speed if they haven't thought about, maybe there was someone else in the family who had ALS and that was 5-10 years ago. Well, what they were offered for care might be very different from what someone would be offered now in terms of genetic testing. And so not assuming that people know all the information just because of their family history.
Great points. Great points. Um, there's testing that I know people when they go through the DNA 23andMe and in those, and there are some biomarkers on there for Parkinson's and some other things, but there's nothing on ALS for those types of things. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. We wouldn't recommend doing that sort of testing if your goal is, if you're someone who has a diagnosis of ALS and you want to understand why, going to a healthcare provider for that information will be most important.
Well, this has been so enlightening, and it's really a topic I think everyone will agree that is very, very difficult and often the elephant in the room for many, many families, and just very heavy. So I'll make it so approachable. I'm going to have after this links to a link to the article so that people can take a deep dive in it and know exactly what we're talking about and kind of get well versed on it. But if you had a takeaway that you are hoping that folks get from this, what would that be?
It's hard to summarize into one takeaway. It's also hard depending on the audience of who's listening. I would say for a takeaway that I think applies to both people living with the condition, family members of people with the condition, as well as providers, is that genetic testing is something that's not going anywhere. It's become a really integral component of care, and everybody with ALS or FTD should be offered the opportunity to undergo genetic testing if they want, but nobody should ever be forced into it. And genetic counseling is a really important resource that, ideally we would love everyone to have access to, but, even if you don't have access to it, you should absolutely talk to your care team of whoever is on that care team about genetic testing if that's something that's of interest to you.
Right.
Yeah, and just these conversations are hard for patients, families, and providers alike, and knowing that there's resources out there and you're not alone. And I think there's a lot of hope in the direction that the field is going. And hopefully if we did a recap, we'd have a lot more to talk about in terms of where we are in terms of treatments and genetic testing knowledge.
Thank you all so much. I think, you just hit the main word, hope. And there is a lot of hope right now, and there's a lot of hope for families who have genetic mutations in their families, and there's a lot of hope for those who may not. And we know more about the disease than ever before. So we thank you, Lauren and Laynie, for being there for all families, and whether they're impacted or not, to guide them through that process. I also want to thank Mandi Bailey, Dr. Justin Kwan, and Dave Shulman for being our panelists today on our inaugural publication review series. We're really excited about this, and we can't thank you enough. This was really, really insightful, and I think we'll have a big impact on the ALS community. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes, you took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you for having us. I'm sure all of our co-authors for this paper feel similarly. We appreciate you highlighting this work and giving space to such a topic that we feel is so important, but obviously we are biased.
Definitely important. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.